Hello everyone and welcome to .NET Core Central. In today's video, I am going to start discussing about GraphQL, and today's video will be the introduction to GraphQL, and then in the subsequent videos, I'm going to talk about some of the advanced topics around GraphQL. First, let's understand what is GraphQL. GraphQL is an open source query language for API. GraphQL is a runtime for serving those queries with existing data. And then GraphQL gives, and this is probably one of the most important part, is that GraphQL gives clients option to ask for what exactly they need and nothing more or nothing less. And as a consequence of that, GraphQL allows APIs to change over time without impacting the client and need for API versioning. Now, all of these 4 points will be clear once we get into the example and walk through how to build GraphQL with .NET 6 and C# 10. I am using .NET 6 and C# 10, but you can use .NET 5 or .NET Core 3.1 with the same set of Nuget packages that I will be using today. So let us open a project that I created. So this is a project that I created for GraphQL demo. It has a record for product, which has ID, name, and quantity. And then it has a product provider interface, which has a method called getProducts. And then an implementation for product provider, which returns an array of product. And right now, I'm just sending out hard-coded product array. But as you can understand here, this product information might come from some sort of data store. But for the time being, I'm just sending out in-memory data from this particular method. And then in the program class, I added the product provider into the dependency injection container. And then I created an API called /API/product, which is just returning the products. And if I run this application, we can see the Swagger information, and from there, we will be able to execute the REST API and see the output. So now if I execute the REST API here, what you will see is that the product information is showing up. It has ID, name, quantity, and for all the 4 products. But here, for example, if an application just needs the name of all the products, it is still going to get everything over the where. It does not impact so much as for applications which has luxury of having bandwidth. But for applications which doesn't want to use that much of bandwidth, that's a lot of waste of data across the where. And now the option with REST is to create another endpoint which will just return the name as an array instead. But as you can see, if we have to support multiple scenarios, then we are unnecessarily creating multiple endpoints. And it is also not flexible, because what if someone wants a combination of ID and name only in the response? Then as you can see, you are going to end up creating multiple permutation and combination of API, and the maintenance cost is extremely high. And this is the main use case of GraphQL. Basically allowing you to query the data on top of the REST API so that the user can decide whether they need ID or name or quantity, or ID and name, or ID and quantity, and mix and match whichever way they want. And this is extremely helpful when your object contains multiple property. It also provides a way to combine multiple API calls. That is something we are going to cover in the subsequent videos. Now let's get back to the solution again. Let me stop this. Now for the purpose of GraphQL, now there are few Nuget packages available out there, but I am going to use the GraphQL Nuget package. And the first thing I'm going to install is the GraphQL. And as you can see, the GraphQL works with .NET Standard version 2.1 and 2.0, which means it's going to work with .NET Core 3.1, .NET 5, .NET 6, even with legacy .NET Framework. So I'm going to first install this. And after this is installed, next thing I'm going to install is GraphQL.server.transport.ASP.NET Core.systemtext.json. That is the one which will be used when we configure the GraphQL. And I'm going to talk about it when we go there. So that's the next Nuget package. And as you can see, this Nuget package actually supports .NET 5 and .NET Core App 3.1. So of course, it's going to support .NET 6. And the last thing that I'm going to use is another Nuget package. And the one that I'm going to install is graphql.server.ui.altair. This is a UI which will help us play around with the GraphQL query. Though we can use Postman also to execute GraphQL, but this is very useful in terms of playing around with different query and also to look into the documentation for GraphQL. So now that all these are installed, let's go back to our product. So the way GraphQL works is for GraphQL, for model, for example, here product is a model that we are using. For GraphQL, we have to create a mapping type because GraphQL does not understand the model out of box. So we have to create some sort of mapping. And the way we do it is we create a class which derives from object graph type from the GraphQL, and then we define the fields inside of this. So the way we are going to do it is, first let's create a public class and we can name it as product type. And it is going to derive from object graph type. And I'm going to add the namespace. The namespace is graphql.type. And let me make this namespace as a global namespace in program.cs so that I don't have to repeat it in other files. So this is the product type, and in the product type, in the constructor, this is where we are going to configure the fields. So for that, there is a method which is provided by the base object graph type. It's called field. And for the field, it takes a lambda function. So I'm going to provide the first field we want to expose is ID. And then similarly, we are going to expose the name and quantity. So name and quantity. This will create the type which is necessary for GraphQL. The next thing what we are going to do is now we are going to create a query. And the query is the one which is responsible for providing the query or the get method from GraphQL. And for GraphQL, the post, put, and edit is supported by something called mutation, which we will discuss in the subsequent video. But the get method is essentially supported by something called query. So for query, we need to create a class called query class. And the query class is going to derive from the object graph type. And for simplicity, I'm just keeping all the class into the same file, but you don't have to do that. You can create different files for different classes. For me, just to look into everything in one place, I'm just doing that. So you can just say product query, that's the name. And then here, what we can do is, again, we can create a constructor. And the product query is the one which is responsible for actually returning the data. So we would need to inject the I product provider. So I'm going to create I product provider. And here we are going to again use the field, and we are going to provide a name and a resolver to give the name to the data and how to resolve or how to get the data. So here we are going to say first we are going to say field, and here for GraphQL the return types, especially in terms of things like list, are not going to be standard .NET list. So for the return type we are going to use something called list graph type. And since we are returning an array of product type, not necessarily product, as I mentioned, we cannot return the out of box product, but we will be returning product type. So the products will internally get converted into product type. So here we are going to say, okay, we are returning product type, and then we are going to give the name, and the name is equal to products. And then we are not going to have description or any other parameter, but we are going to have resolve. And for resolve, we're going to use the lambda. And here we are going to say product provider dot get products. So that's our resolver. And here, though the get product is returning an array of product, but it will be internally converted into the product type. So we do that. So now this particular query now is going to allow us to query products. But before we finish, the third and another important thing we have to do is we have to define the schema. So for that, and schema is the third thing that we have to do for GraphQL. The first one was the type, where we define the type, then the query, and the third thing is the schema. And schema is what will be used for documentation. And documentation is very important, just like Swagger Doc. You need to have documentation for GraphQL so that the clients can understand what to query and what are the different attributes which are available to query from. So for this one, I'm going to create public class product schema, and product schema is going to derive from the schema base class. And then here we're going to create the constructor, and inside of constructor we are going to inject the iService provider. And the iService provider is something we are going to also provide it to the base class so that the base class can use it. And then we are going to set the query property. And for the query property, we're just going to get service provider dot get required service. And for the required service, we are looking at product query here. So we're going to say product query. And this is how we configure the query parameter. So we said for the schema, we're saying that the query is going to support the product query, and product query is currently supporting products. So this is what is going to show up in the schema. And then once we define the type, the query, and the schema, the next thing for us is to add all the things necessary for dependency injection. So let's go to the program, and in the dependency injection, we already added the product provider. Next thing we are going to do is we are going to add singleton, and here we are going to say I schema, and for the schema we are going to provide product schema. Product schema is the thing that we have to expose. So now we have exposed the product schema. Next thing what we are going to do is we are going to add the GraphQL service. So we can say builder.services.add GraphQL, and here it takes a delegate. So I can say option, it's going to option, I don't want to map anything, so we can say option dot enable metrics. I'm going to set it to false. I'm going to show you what enable metrics is, but let me first set it to false because it's a little bit of noise, but then I'll set it to true to show what it is. And then finally we're going to say add system text JSON, and this is part of the GraphQL.server namespace. So I'm just going to add the namespace here. And once I do that, I have configured the GraphQL in the dependency injection container. And finally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, for the app, I'm going to use the GraphQL, but I also want to use the Nuget package that I added for the UI purpose, which is the Altair. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say app.use GraphQL Altair. And then I'm going to say app.use GraphQL, and here I'm going to pass the iSchema. So this is pretty much standard that we always have to do. And a couple of things I forgot is we also have to add the product type and the product query. These two also needs to be added. Now let's run the application. If we go here to UI/Altair, we can see the user interface for the GraphQL playground. And in this UI, if we expand the dock, we can see products, Once we click on products, we can look into the fields of product. As you can see, it is product type and it has ID, name and quantity, and this is what we exposed to the product type and the schema documentation. And now if we have to search for all the products with all the fields, what we are going to do is we're going to say query, as you can see, and here we can say products, and for products we can say ID, quantity, and you can see it has some sort of intelligence, and name. And if we run the query now, we are going to get all the products with ID, quantity and name, and this is pretty much same as the standard REST API. But here, this is where the magic is going to happen. If we want to just get rid of these two property and execute now, we can get just the name. Similarly, if we want to get name and ID, we can get name and ID and the way we want. Similarly, if we want to get the product twice, we can say, we can give an alias to them. So we can say products1 colon, and that's a product. And then we can say products2, and we can say product. And here we can just get the quantity. So we'll have one schema for getting name and ID and the other one for the quantity. And we can run this query. And as you can see, the first array is returning the name and ID, and second one is just the quantity. So you can see how powerful this can be in terms of querying. Now we can do the exact same thing in Postman. So let me show how it works in Postman. In Postman, what we can do is we can copy paste the URL from here and the query. So we can come here, this is going to be post, and here instead of this, it's going to be GraphQL. And in the body, we have this option of sending GraphQL data. So I'm going to select that. And here I can do the same thing. I can have query, and inside query, I can have products, and inside products, I can have ID and name, and I can execute this, and I'm going to get the ID and name as expected. And if I just need the name, just get rid of this, send a query. And as you can see, this is using standard Postman call. We're able to make a GraphQL call. Now, so far we just played around with an array. Now let us expose get product by ID. For that, what we are going to do is we are going to go into the product query here. And here we are going to add a field, and we are going to say it's a product type. And for the name, we can pass the name as product. And this is what is going to show up in the schema. And after the name, what we have to do is we also have to provide a parameter. So for parameter, we have to provide arguments. So we can say arguments, and in the arguments, we can create a new query arguments. And inside of query argument, it takes an param of query argument array. So I'll just create a single query argument. And for the query argument, the type, now type is very important. The type that we are going to take is an integer. But when it comes to GraphQL, it's going to be the GraphQL type. So it's the int GraphQL type. So it's going to be int graph type. And then for the name, we are going to give this as ID, because that is what we are going to expect. And then finally, we are going to use the resolve argument, where we are going to do get products dot first dot default, and we can say product dot ID is equal to, and here we want to get the argument. So we can get the argument from this parameter, which is the iResolve field context or the context. So we can say x dot get argument, type is int, and the name of argument is going to be ID, and the get arguments is part of the GraphQL namespace. So I'm going to add it, So that's all we have to do. Now if I go ahead and run this, we are going to now see two schemas, essentially one for product and one for products, and we can query both. Now if I refresh, you can see now inside of product I see products and product. Products is something we saw earlier. Now for product, we see that it expects an input parameter of int. So it has an argument of int id, and then it returns id name. So here what I can do is, to the same query I can add product, and if I do product, I'll have to pass the id, and the id, let's say I want id of 2, and here I can take the name and quantity. And now if I execute, I can see the product is showing up here. Let me get rid of the other two products and just execute the product, and we can see the product is showing up here. And similarly, you can get multiple product as a part of the same query using aliases. So we can say, and here we can say product id 4, and for that you can just get the name, let's say. And if you execute, you see that the product 2 is this, product 4 is monitor. So as you can see, it's really easy to get us going with GraphQL. Now we can take the same query and execute in Postman, and we're going to see the exact same response there as well. And as you can see, we see the exact same response here in the Postman as well. So this is the very basic introduction to GraphQL. Now another thing we can do is, for ID we can use some sort of variable mechanism, and once we use variable, the variable can be passed across. So now if you want to show the variable, we can do it here. So we can, let's say I just want to deal with one product, and for the query we can say, we can declare the variable here as id, and we can say id is an integer and it's a non-optional one, and here we can say $id. And then for the GraphQL variables here, we can pass id as 1. So we can execute, and it's going to be laptop, and here now we can change it to 3, execute, it's keyboard, 4, monitor. So as you can see, without changing the query every time, we can just change the variable and reuse the query as is. So this is another nifty feature of GraphQL that we can use. So in this video, we just walked through how to use GraphQL to do queries, and we dealt with the scenario of a product service and product query and how to use it in multiple scenarios. And this is just an introduction to GraphQL using the GraphQL Nuget packages. And as I mentioned, the GraphQL mainly works through between these extension method to services and these middleware. Between these two, it takes care of all the internal mechanism, and the use GraphQL at layer takes care of showing the UI to us. Now as I mentioned, I can set it, right now it is false, I can set it to true, and let's show you what happens if we set it to true. When we set it to, if we run this, we get this extra set of information. This is mainly the tracing information which we get. So we don't want to set it to true in a production environment, but if we want to debug and see some of this information, then yes, it makes sense to set it to true. But this is how you can use it. And regarding the variable, the UI also, there's an option of variable, so we can expand this, and then we can do the same thing here. We can say id is an integer, and we can use $id here. Let me get rid of these, and then here we can pass the id. For the value we can say 2, execute, we're just going to get the data for 2 here. Similarly, if we pass 4, we are going to get the data for 4. So we can use variable either in the Altair UI or in Postman. So this is all I wanted to cover for today's video. This is a very basic introduction about GraphQL. In the subsequent videos, we are going to talk about mutation, which is how you can do post-put, and some of the other features of GraphQL. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. If you are new to my channel and if you think you are getting value out of my channel, please subscribe to my channel. And thanks so much for watching this video.